I'm Scott Al Miller. It's the 1st of November 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in Leon, Nicaragua. Today, we're going to be talking about exactly what went on with COVID here in Nicaragua and why things are very different with how everything played out here. There's some interesting history and some demographics in that story that I think just make a lot of sense that people need to hear, because it's like there's just a lot of things that were missed, and I think it's very interesting. We're also going to talk about whether or not you need a passport here or in other areas as you're coming here, should you be coming from the US or Canada, where you may be able to travel here by land rather than taking a flight. So we'll get to all of that right after the bump. Before we get on to the more complex topic of what went on with COVID here in Nicaragua, it's not really complex, just a more lengthy one. We're going to talk about passports because this question came up. And I already did a short about this, but it's worth mentioning because different people see different things. So the question came up, Scott, I'm traveling by land to Nicaragua and I don't have a passport. Am I going to need one somewhere along the way? I'm not sure where the idea that you wouldn't need a passport comes from. I can only imagine that it is because there is some information about limited passport requirements in Mexico and Canada, and that the US often kind of lumps Central America together with Mexico as if it's somehow a related region. But it's important to note that Nicaragua is no more a part of Mexico than, say, Oregon or Colorado are, meaning that 200 years ago, yeah, it kind of was part of Mexico, but it's been hundreds of years and there's no political affiliation today. The US was also a part of Mexico the same way that we are, and people there don't think of it in that way in any way whatsoever, even though if you go there, there's clearly a lot of heritage. So in general, you need a passport when traveling internationally. This applies to everyone from everywhere. The exceptions for that is when you're traveling within an explicit border zone. So if you're a Nicaraguan and you are not going to leave your border zone here in Nicaragua, which means you can go to Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, technically you can do so without a passport. It's still recommended that you have a passport, because what if there's any hassle? It's nice to have that piece of paper. What if for some reason you got pushed over another border in case of an emergency? Then you're legally able to travel. You never really want to be without a passport. Even if you don't plan on leaving your home country, not having a passport is a risk there's no reason to really take. Get your passports, people. Always have it at the ready. But okay, that aside, if you live in Europe, you can move around the Schengen zone. As long as you're not crossing out of that border, you don't have to have a passport. But most people in that have a passport because it is their identity documents within that zone. But you don't technically have to have it. It is a borderless, passportless zone. But to get into it or out of it, you certainly need a passport. The US has a semi-similar zone with Canada and Mexico, meaning they have a soft border there, but it is a semi-soft border. Under certain circumstances, moving between those countries requires a passport, and under certain circumstances, it requires a document like a passport, such as a passport card, which is technically not a passport, or a driver's license with a passport international card built into it. Again, not an actual passport. So in those cases, you can say, I don't need a passport, and you're correct, but you do need passport-like documents, and it's not that simple. In many cases, you must have a driver's license that has a passport identity card built into it. Most states do this naturally, so a lot of people don't think about it, and you have to carry your birth certificate with you and do those together, and they allow you to bypass having a passport. I don't recommend doing that because a lot of countries and a lot of places in those countries are not going to be familiar with that, and I don't know how much that actually works in Mexico. I have heard some stories, and this may be completely wrong, and I tried to look into it and I couldn't find the answer, so this is probably hearsay. Well, it's definitely hearsay at this point, but it's probably incorrect. But I have heard rumors that crossing into Mexico without a passport, you are limited to certain parts of the country, whereas with a passport you can just move around. I do know that there are limitations like that for sure with a car, and I don't know if people have just mentioned it and applied that car logic to something else, and then it's just so take that with a grain of salt. assume you can get into and move around Mexico just fine as long as you have all the proper documentation, but it's not going to be as easy as just having a passport. So I highly recommend that. But if you really don't want to travel past Canada or Mexico, in theory, as long as you don't need to get on a flight home, you can do that. But because you're limited and don't have the option of getting on a plane, I would never recommend doing that. You should never travel to another country where you can't just go to an airport and head out, or go to a boat, or cross over whatever's necessary, whatever border is necessary for safety. If you were in Oaxaca and something dangerous happened in Mexico and you didn't have a passport, you probably couldn't fly around Mexico. You definitely couldn't fly back to the United States, and you wouldn't be able to get out to Guatemala. You'd be trapped. So it's just for safety. You should always have a passport. That said, every other place that an American wants to go needs a passport. It doesn't matter if you're going to Europe, to Central America. There are very limited exceptions to this that are like cruise ships where they take you and you're basically on a tour and you're never allowed to actually enter the country. Technically, you're on their soil, but you're never really entering the country. They have special accommodations for that where you don't necessarily need a passport, but it's also not like you're going to that country. It doesn't apply to any real world scenario. If you're actually going to anywhere, Guatemala, Honduras, it doesn't matter, all those countries, every one of them requires you, because it's a full international border, it is a hard border at Mexico, Guatemala, you have to have a passport to cross that border. Once you cross that border, the majority of countries you're going to come to will require that you have a passport on you at all times. Now, that doesn't mean you absolutely have to do that, but take that with a grain of salt. The law is the law, but those of us who live down here and would have to carry our passports literally all the time everywhere, and that's kind of risky, we don't really do that. We keep our passports someplace safe where we can get to easily, and if you're just traveling a little ways from home, even just a couple hours to the capital, I don't carry my passport with me. Most people do not. And if you were to get stopped, normally they're happy with your driver's license. If for some reason they're like, no, we got to have your passport, and I have had this happen, you go, I'm really sorry, can we go to my house and get it? And generally it's not a big problem. It can, but you do have to be aware, it can cause problems, but generally not very big ones. It's not like you're committing a heinous crime and they want to get rid of you, but it may put you in some peril. Nothing too serious, but it is a risk that you're taking on. So especially as a tourist, you would generally have your passport with you all the time. It's only if you're like a resident tourist, meaning you're basically living here, you have stable housing, you have a place that's very safe to lock it up, you need to do regular errands, and you don't want to have your passport in your pocket when you just go to the market, for example, or that makes sense. So use reasonable precautions. I'm not saying don't do that, but be aware once you cross the Guatemalan border, not only is it an absolute showstopper requirement, there is zero chance that you're going to be able to legally cross any border without a passport once you're south of Mexico. Zero. Every single border, it's not like most of the time or under normal circumstances, you absolutely have to have a passport under all circumstances, and you should keep it with you at all times. So your passport is your life once you're outside of the US, Canada, and Mexico. Once you leave the North American countries, as they're referred to here. And that's how we think of it, right? Central America is one region, North America is one region. And I think what's happening is a couple people have been confused about this. The CA4, the Central American Four, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, operate as a single border zone. You don't have to get a visa or do a hard border change as you move between those countries. Once you've entered one, you're in a single border zone, the same as the Schengen in Europe. This is very simple. It is not complicated. If you have a bunch of questions about it, you're missing the big picture, right? They share an international border around the four countries. Unlike the Schengen, though, when you move between the constituent states inside of that border, you still have to go through a border control, but it is a soft border. You do not have to have a visa stamp. You do not reset your visa. You have not gone through a full security checkpoint. You're going through a partial checkpoint. You still have to have your passport. You must show it. They have to see your visa, but they're not issuing you a new visa. They're checking that your current visa is current. That is all. So think of them more like states than like individual countries, but states that have a border check as you move between them and very differing laws. So it's kind of like how Europe was before the Schengen. They have a lot of shared resources, but they're still independent places. That, I think, because there is this shared border zone for this one particular region, people then apply that to, well, Mexico must be part of that region, Panama must be part of that region, Costa Rica must be part of that region, and it starts sprawling into everywhere must be passport free, and that is nowhere is passport free, right? Mexico has limited options without a passport, and it is definitely not advised. If you're just crossing over by land, you're going to Tijuana, you want to party for the day, there's no chance you need to fly somewhere from there, whatever, that's fine. But when you're actually going to Mexico, you're gonna go to Mexico City, you're gonna go like somewhere into Mexico, and you have any chance you might need to be airlifted for a medical emergency, or you may need to travel back somewhere very quickly because of a family emergency, then absolutely you should have a passport. It would be pretty irresponsible to try to travel without one. So what happened with COVID here in Nicaragua? This is kind of an interesting story just because COVID here was so dramatically different than in other places. And before we get started, let me preface. I was in Nicaragua in late 2019 when COVID was technically incubating in China, but we didn't really know about it yet. And I had gone back before it hit. I was living in Texas, making plans for moving to Nicaragua at the time that COVID hit in Texas. I became trapped in Texas during early COVID, even though I was trying to get back to Nicaragua. So I spent the worst period, the scariest period of COVID in Texas, but in contact with Nicaragua, with an office here, talking about coming back down, and so we were very involved. We then moved down in early 2021 when COVID was still very much in full swing. We moved down prior to the Delta variant coming out, so we got to see that play out first person. We were able to get our vaccinations in the United States prior to moving down. We did that in Texas, and so we were always in Nicaragua vaccinated ourselves. Our kids were not, so we kind of fell into a middle ground, just the adults were, and additional vaccines were still needed as other variants came out, just to give you kind of a where we fit firsthand into our observations of what was going on. So what made Nicaragua a lot different than many other countries in the region, including the US and Canada, but also completely different than, say, Honduras, which is right next door, is that Nicaragua really never went into a full lockdown. This throws people off because it seems like the whole world was on lockdown, and that someplace like Nicaragua, in the middle of a region that went to very serious lockdown, did not, is often very surprising. I spent some time in Honduras during that window as well, and even when COVID had backed off to some degree, Honduras was an extreme lockdown situation. They had early curfews, they had police on the street making sure people social distance on sidewalks. Every business was monitoring you as you came and went. It was really strict, nothing that we had seen in the United States. Now, we lived in Texas, which was not the strongest lockdown. We never had the terrible curfews and stuff. But what Honduras did was much more extreme than anywhere I saw in the United States. Maybe not as extreme as Quebec, but it was pretty strong. Nicaragua basically kept everything business as usual. And the reasons why they did this probably have a lot to do with they didn't have the ability to keep the wheels of the economy moving if they sent everyone home. The way that the economy works here, it's heavily agrarian. It would have completely derailed the ability to feed everyone and to keep the lights on. So it was a very high risk, I think, compared to other countries, but other countries took pretty big risks on this too, and often did a lot of damage. I think this worked in Nicaragua's favor long-term relative to other countries. Obviously, everyone was crippled by COVID overall. Nicaragua, although it did those things from an economic standpoint, I believe, it's important to understand that Nicaragua is, and you can't tell this from statistics very well, but a very loosely populated country. Now, if you look at pure demographics, the United States has a lower population density than Nicaragua, so that seems like, oh, it's more urban, but that's not really the case. The United States has massive urban areas on the coast with massive areas that are completely empty in the middle. Canada also, huge empty areas, but the average person who lives in the United States or Canada lives in much more densely populated areas than the average person who lives in Nicaragua. The most densely populated portions of Nicaragua are not anywhere close to the densities of normal cities in the United States, and often not even close to the suburban densities, sometimes, but not often. So in general, Nicaragua has a very spread out population. Even Managua itself is very sprawling. You never get super tight populations. This itself means that diseases that are spread through human contact, especially airborne ones, are heavily curtailed through spread in Nicaragua compared to other countries. They'll still spread, of course, but Nicaragua is really at danger from mosquito spread illnesses, which COVID is not, compared to airborne illnesses like COVID. So that aspect of things was very different. Nicaragua did mandate masks, but very loosely, but they did have a mask mandate. But that was about the only thing that they did early on. When we were here, and for quite some time, there was no vaccines available. Nicaragua just wasn't eligible to get any because countries that had developed them didn't have enough for themselves and their close partners. And so Nicaragua was low on the list. During that time, the death rate in Nicaragua was pretty horrific. The degree to which COVID was spreading was not that bad because of the reasons I mentioned, and I'm going to get a little bit more into that in a second, but the actual rate of death from it was quite high because there was no vaccinations at all, and the hospitals were quickly pressed to capacity. So that was really rough. We definitely had a bit of impact, and everyone knew someone who was deeply impacted by a COVID infection. Of course, that's mostly true in every country, so that was not unique here, but we were here for a portion of it that shouldn't have been as bad as what we had seen in the US, and it was actually, I would say, worse. The thing, I talked to some doctors about this, and people hadn't really thought about it, but there's a couple big factors that seem to give Nicaragua, and sometimes some other countries in the region, some big advantages. One is the overall temperature. COVID is known to spread a little bit better when the air is heavier and cold, and here it is almost always light and warm. That does not stop the spread, but it reduces the spread. Even if you just take 5% chance off of infection, that dramatically reduces how much it goes from one person to another. So the fact that the air temperature is always warm helps quite a bit. That air conditioning is essentially never used here goes a really long way. We believe, there aren't studies on this, but common sense. And at the time, I talked to doctors about this, like, oh my gosh, yeah, of course. In places like the United States, where it is absolutely unavoidable that you're going to have lots of people sharing closed air systems, the chances of getting an infection from one person to another is much higher than in Nicaragua, where even if you have people in the same density inside a house, which is still unlikely, they tend to be more spread out in their homes as well, you're likely to have open windows with fresh air blowing through, and if there's anything going on to move air, but it's fans. And so the amount of air and the amount of changing air that moves through a structure is dramatically higher than in, say, the United States or Canada by orders of magnitude. And that means that the opportunity for airborne anything to stay airborne and to infect another person is incredibly minimal compared to the same environments somewhere else. And the overall lack of human interaction, even though people are very social here, the ease at which it is to stay far apart from each other when you're on the sidewalk or just anything in life, because you can see where I am, right? And you see my videos when I walk through the city. It's easy to have lots of space between you and other people because everything is big and sprawling, and we have open space available to almost everyone. And so people just aren't generally pressed together in most circumstances. These things really do go a long way, and they're completely natural. No one thought about it. No one did it intentionally. It just ended up that the natural environment of Nicaragua seems to have very strongly discouraged the spread of COVID compared to other places, and that did a lot to protect it when there weren't a lot of other official medical mechanisms maybe to do so. Also, it is generally seen in studies, and I had predicted this at the beginning of COVID, and people are like, no one ever believes me when I say these things. And then later when it's like, oh, that seemed crazy at the time, but I guess the science holds it up. When you look at the early spread of COVID, it spread much more rapidly and was much more deadly within populations that were Caucasian. European populations, though, specifically with high degrees of Neanderthal DNA, seem to contract and spread COVID much more rapidly than others. And I have a friend who has a family that are doctors in Malawi, for example, and I talked to those doctors early on during the pandemic, and they were very scared for good reason, right, that the pandemic may rip through Africa with high population densities and very low medical care facility capacity, and that they may have seen really, really terrible death rates from that. And I said to them, I think from what we've seen that is not likely, given that it seems to be the Neanderthal DNA or whatever aspects of Caucasian DNA are making that population far more vulnerable, and that sub-Saharan Africa may be able to withstand this naturally much better. And at the time, that seemed like a really strange theory, but that has held up, and now scientific research has backed that up. I just did it from statistics and common sense, and it certainly seemed like a reasonable thing, but it took many years before they did really deep research into it, and that has held up. All that to be said, here in Nicaragua, the DNA from those Europeans that are at most risk, while it is certainly present, it is not as prevalent as, say, in the United States or Canada, and probably not as prevalent in, say, Mexico or even Honduras. Here, I think it tends to be just a little bit lower, giving just another slight advantage to the local population from a genetic disposition towards contracting COVID. Now, importantly, there were no vaccines early on, so there was nothing that Nicaragua could do to vaccinate people. It simply didn't have access to vaccines. So what were they supposed to do? They worked with what they had. Around about the time that Delta was in full swing, we had the very big benefit that Honduras, which is very close to us here, had an excess of vaccines. And at that point, once they had vaccinated their own people, they moved doctors to the border and dropped border controls and allowed Nicaraguans to go over the border to get vaccinated in Honduras. They would be expected to return immediately. Like we talk about it a lot, it's a soft border zone, so this worked out pretty easily. Honduras didn't have to go through a lot of effort to make that plausible, but that was a popular thing, and for a few weeks, everyone we knew was trying to get over the Honduran border to get their vaccines there. El Salvador was also giving out vaccines for free at some later point for anyone traveling through, which included Nicaraguans, of course. So they knew in the northern countries that by inoculating the Nicaragua on the southern border that it would help to keep COVID from spreading into their countries via that path. So they took very aggressive measures to try to protect Nicaragua as well, which we very much appreciate down here. That only lasted a few weeks before the first supplies of vaccines were supplied to Nicaragua. And Nicaragua went from no vaccines to a very, very, very aggressive vaccination program practically overnight. And in doing that, we watched COVID go from absolutely devastating to all but over in a matter of weeks. The speed at which it ended was crazy. So at that point, we went from basically zero vaccinated to nearly everyone vaccinated in just a matter of weeks. The country went from terrified of COVID to over it and not even worrying about it in those same matter of weeks. And because there had never been a lockdown, a lot of the cultural changes, I think, that affected other places, the US, Canada, anywhere, Europe, right, where people were really mentally affected and really socially affected by COVID, I think didn't happen here, or did, but much less. I was reading a thing today from Gen Zers, it was like BuzzFeed or something, where Gen Zers were giving their why our lives are different than millennials kind of outlook. And some of the things they said is, you don't realize how much they were affected by the fact that many of them lost their childhoods or high schools or college experiences, or their early work years were completely lost because they were stuck in COVID lockdowns. They didn't get the social or the educational or the business experiences that were expected of people at that age, giving them a massive, massive back foot compared to people who were younger than them, older than them, those who had gone through and become early age professionals prior to COVID had no back pressure. They didn't have juniors coming behind them, so they had a lot of opportunity to not have to compete against the barely younger, the people who would be hired just months later. And those who were coming up behind them would get the same opportunities for education and travel and work internships and those kinds of things basically at the same time as them. So someone who was 3 years younger would suddenly be on the same footing as someone who was 20 and someone who was 17 may suddenly be in the same position. And so the people who were in that very tight range where they should have been in late high school or early college and doing their early work years and didn't get to because of COVID simply lost those years, whereas those who were either they were just in middle school and it didn't matter, or they were already into the workforce and accumulating experience, they managed to move forward as if nothing had happened, more or less. But those who were caught in the middle lost that time completely. It was just lost to them. It was as if that part of their lives didn't happen. And so they were affected not just career-wise, not just education-wise, but it is an unbelievable emotional impact on them that potentially creates and is continuing to create a lot of problems for that generation, and always will. That generation will never fully recover from losing those years to the pandemic, and it was such a dramatic way because of the lockdown. But because we didn't have the lockdown here in Nicaragua, everyone kept going to school, everyone kept going to university, they changed some things, right? Flexible things happened, but people kept moving forward. Jobs still happened the same as before, and so we don't see that huge impact to that generation, and we also don't seem to see the emotional, the psychological impact that the United States has seen for so many people going through COVID. And we just had this discussion on the channel. Some people were posting, right, post-COVID, the United States and Canada have become very aggressive. People are very angry. People have, they're very, life is very divisive. We see customers of businesses are much just angrier, and they get angry if you're expecting them to pay the bills for things that they've already consumed. It's crazy. And those things always existed, but the percentages seem to be very different now. And everyone agreed, right? Everyone's like, yeah, that is what it's like now. We've all seen the change. And basically everyone points to, it was different before COVID, it's different after COVID. But the question came up, is that happening in Nicaragua? And as far as I can tell, and everyone I've talked to has agreed, no, Nicaragua has had none of that. It is absolutely not the case. Because of the lack of lockdown, we assume the mental toll that was taken on so many people by those years becoming antisocial, all the time you couldn't go out and hang out with other people, just didn't happen here, and people continued life as normal, and psychological development happened as normal. It's a lot of rain all of a sudden. So the way that Nicaragua interacted with COVID was just dramatically different than what most of the developed world did. And I think in many ways we just got lucky here that it worked out, that we felt we had to go that direction, and we didn't feel pressured that we had to copy what everyone else, both regionally and more globally, were doing. But it worked out in our favor, I think, that long-term the impacts are much lower. And most importantly, it seems to be that the happiness, the overall situation for the culture is just dramatically better. And that's a hard thing to put a number on, a hard thing to really sit down and define and say, wow, this is so much different than I was expecting. But it really is where we see it, that you don't have these people that are still sitting around being upset about it. You don't see where the culture was divided about how to approach it. Like, everyone was on the same page. We got to work together. We don't go overboard. We do the things we need to do. And everyone did get together and get over it, right, really quickly. Everyone was on the same page, was on the same team. And I think overall, not that there was zero discussion, that there were zero problems, but it was a very different thing, completely different than anything we saw in North America. And it's an important bit of understanding when you talk to Americans, when you talk to Canadians, their viewpoint of so much of the world now is based on this terrible thing happened and they're upset about it, or they're traumatized by it. And when you come to Nicaragua, it's kind of like, was that a thing? Did that happen? We almost forget. Right? And when we go back to the United States and there's so many infections still going on and people are still so upset about it, it's like, oh my gosh, that was such a major thing here. We honestly forget that in Nicaragua. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're approaching Nicaragua from a cultural and understanding perspective, or for Nicaraguans who are looking at North America to understand that one was very traumatized by this and very affected by it politically and socially and mentally, psychologically, and the other, for the most part, wasn't, and they had very different experiences. Thanks for joining me. Scroll down, ask your questions, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. It really helps me out. If you'd like to directly support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. As always, share with your friends, tell people on social media, post the link onto Facebook or onto LinkedIn or whatever, Reddit, and I will see all of you tomorrow.